hit the little. Okay, Harold. Well, I think, I always say we don't need to introduce Harold, but many people know of Harold and know Harold. He's been very good at presenting to the New Brunswick Historical Society in the winter months when we used to have to worry about traveling and bums and seats and things like that. So Harold was always a stand-up person for January or February. And if you know Harold, he always has a number of interesting talks up his sleeve. So this one was particularly interesting to me. And it combines military history with Indigenous history, which is, I think, two great topics. So Harold, we're going to turn things over to you. I just want to remind people as well that we're going to go to about 8:30. I mean, we'll have to cut it off at 8:30. We'll have some time for Q&A. And I've also put some information in the chat, like on next month, February 22nd, we have a talk, February 22nd by Aaron Spinney in the History Politics Department at UNB St. John. It's a military history topic. And I've also, if you have any rich aunts and uncles, and you have wheelbarrows full of cash you'd like to donate, after you donate your money to Barber's General Store, Reno, Loyalist House could always use your loving care in terms of some donations. New Brunswick Historical Society has custody of that house, which was completed in 1817. And we're always looking for donations. And if you use the link to Canada Helps, it's an online donation site for registered charities across Canada. It'll automatically send you a CRA tax receipt, right? It'll email you this receipt right into your inbox. Anyway, Harold, let's turn things over to you.
Okay, now I can't see anybody, so can you see my PowerPoint marking our place? Can you see my screen, Greg?
I can.
See it.
Yep.
Yes, Harold.
Okay, honoring our New Brunswick Indigenous veterans. I've been sort of interested in this topic from the late 1970s. Haven't done much about it, but then earlier last year, the Legion asked for some help. Well, actually, the Last Post Fund. And luckily, as you can see here are 4 people who have come on board with me to help provide information, images and such. So I just want to make sure I recognize them right off the bat. We're going to hear a bit more about Greg Nicholas shortly, and Chief Terry Richardson also. So that's my acknowledgements. Okay, the Last Post Fund in 2019 started an initiative to recognize, first find and then recognize Indigenous veterans across the country who are in unmarked graves. And you may not think that there are veterans in unmarked graves, but not only are we finding a lot, we're finding a lot of other veterans who are not Indigenous in unmarked graves. And I've actually found 4 St. John veterans killed during the war, First War or Second War, that were forgotten. They weren't even commemorated by the War Graves Commission. So there's been a lot of positive things that have happened. But what I'd like to do is give you an idea of what we're doing here in New Brunswick. And I'm sure everybody here agrees that every veteran deserves the respect and remembrance. Our First Nations, and sadly they don't know a lot about some of their veterans and their service, let alone the rest of the province. We're going to be able to put the service of our veterans, our New Brunswick veterans, into the context of a wider picture of Canadian veterans. And it's my firm belief that as we do all this, that'll help us all on that path of reconciliation that we have talked so much about for a number of years. There are over 400 that we know of so far that served in the First, Second Wars and the Korean conflict. We have a few databases now that list them, but when you add those that have served in the Cold War, and including today, we must be well over 1,000 plus. So part of what we're trying to do, what I'm trying to do as an historian and also with the Legion, is to identify not only every Indigenous veteran, but also their stories, which ones don't have grave markers, but I'll go into the grave markers in a bit more. But we've taken a coordinated approach. No other province has done this, so we're sort of the first. We've hired a student from St. Mary's who was attending St. Thomas. She is collecting our information, and as you can see, we have quite a few partners. I also wear a hat as the public relations person for the New Brunswick command of the Legion, and I saw this as an opportunity for the Legions to collect information, support our Indigenous veterans, provide some funding. And Greg Nicholas, who there can't be anybody here tonight that doesn't know who Greg Nicholas is, but I want to tell you a wee bit more about him a bit further on. So this is some of our support staff. Tanya is our student. Chief Terry Richardson is a Canadian Forces veteran. There's a tall, handsome guy on the right with a very little hair. And then there's this gentleman, Marcel Thibodeau, I met last fall up in the Miramichi. He's with Eel Ground. He is a veteran himself, and he and the Legion members up at Miramichi branch number 10 have been stupendous in their efforts to recognize veterans. And you see Marcel standing next to one of the new grave markers. Up until about a year ago, there were only 15 recognized First Nations in New Brunswick. Last year, the province recognized a 16th. So we now have 16 First Nations. And this is a list of those that we have an idea where they're buried and how many are buried in these particular cemeteries. So first off, all of these veterans you see listed here up in Region A, Tobique has 87. All 87 men and women have to be researched straight through. And once we get through those 38 cemeteries, then we have to find out who's buried in non-Indigenous cemeteries, who aren't buried. There are some not buried in New Brunswick. I spent about a month of time trying to verify one buried in New York State. Turned out he wasn't born until after the war, Second War, so it was a false flag on that particular research. So we have 3 First Nations cultures: Micmac, northeast and part of the province, the Maliseet along the river valley, and the Passamaquoddy and the St. Croix River watershed. We have a large province to research, 16 communities, and we're behind the ball because other provinces have been doing research on the First Nations veterans for a number of years. And in terms of the project of grave markers, they started it 3 years ago, and we only came on board last year. Now, last month, Greg Nicholas did a presentation to the York Sudbury Historical Society on Canadian Indigenous veterans, and he put things into a global and a Canadian context of some of our Canadian veterans, the problems that they had serving, the more problems they had, the bigotry, the prejudice they suffered after their service. I'm not even going to try to pronounce Francis's name here, but he is our most decorated First War Indigenous veterans, an amazing sniper. He has a military medal in 2 bars, so basically he won that particular bravery medal 3 times. So Graydon put it into a national context, and I'm trying to put a New Brunswick context in this. So for example, Tommy Price, Second World War, Korean War veteran, a Military Cross, U.S. Silver Star for bravery. Just about anybody in the military history knows all about Tommy Price. But do they know about Oliver Poches of New Brunswick? No. Do they know about any of our veterans? Chances are they don't. Tommy Price, as you see here, an amazing military heritage, but basically died a pauper in 1977. It wasn't until after the fact that we as Canadians realized that he and the rest of our Indigenous veterans were not treated. There is a saying, and I'm going to finish my presentation. In the military, we say a veteran is a veteran is a veteran. We say that at the Legion. Well, for most of the heritage of our Indigenous veterans, a veteran is a veteran as long as they're not an Indigenous veteran. And I'll talk a bit more about that as we go through. So let's take a look now at some of our New Brunswick Indigenous veterans that served from the First War right through to present day. Some we've got lots of information, some we have a bit of information, some we have photographs, some we don't. But this is only the beginning, and I'm hoping some of you would like to help out, pick up the torch and help us make sure. So let's take a look at Private Moses Francis. Born in New Brunswick, but he grew up in the Indian Reserve in Truro, served with the Nova Scotia Rifles in the First World War. He was a lumberjack. He gave his birth date as 1897, so when he enlisted he was 19 years old. And the physical description, the dark complexion Indian, that is a quote from his service record. Some of the service records for our Indigenous veterans state that they're Maliseet or Micmac or they're Indian. Some, you couldn't tell unless you already knew. He made it to England. And while he was in England, they found out two things. He had a weak heart and that he was a minor. He wasn't born until 19, so he's 15 years old. And as Greg as I were talking earlier, several people and Indigenous veterans have told me, and family members, that one of the reasons that they served was not because they were serving because they loved Canada. Canada had been good to them. They actually enlisted to serve because the Crown had been good to them. They were serving for their monarch as opposed to serving for the country. Pioneer Joseph Peter Paul of Red Bank. He was with the First World War, as you can see here. He was shot and killed. He's buried in France, as you see here at the gravesite. So our veterans, we have some who were underage and were dismissed or couldn't fight. We have some who were died on service. Some caught tuberculosis. Some had what I call the temporary girlfriend disease after leave and were in hospital for a variety of VD instances. A lot of them had just general service. They did the same thing as most of our Canadian veterans did. Nothing outstanding, nothing good, nothing bad. They just did their general service. And then there were some who excelled, like Tommy Prince, for example, on a national level. Tobique First Nation. This is a plaque that they have of those from their community who were killed. And as you see here, these 4 men were killed. And in the military, the way the Commonwealth War Graves Commission and the Canadian military look at this, there are many different ways to categorize a veteran, or a soldier, excuse me, or an airman or a sailor who dies. You can be killed in action, you could be lost at sea, or if your body is never found, you're missing in action. You could be died on service. For example, if one of our First World War St. John men, he died on service, he has a grave marker, he's got the memorial, he died of cancer. And strangely, about 5 years ago, I spoke to a lady who just received the Civil Memorial Cross for her husband. Her husband only died about a year or so before I met her, and he was a Second War veteran, and my question to her was, well, how do you get the Memorial Cross if he didn't die until 2005 from the Second World War? Well, he was wounded, and the bullet was in the neck, or the bullet fragment. They couldn't operate to remove it, and 2005 or so, the bullet fragment moved, and he died. So he is officially listed as died of wounds, Second World War, although he didn't die until say about 2005. So these particular members of Tobique are those who were killed in action. But we're going to take a quick look at Private Sanford Solas. As you can see, he died in 1945 in Holland. Oh, let me see, what can I tell you about him? He had a grade 8 education. He worked as a casual laborer at times before enlisting. He worked as a hand stitcher in a shoe factory, probably Fredericton. After the war, he said that he wanted to work in the shoe making industry. That was his goal after the war. He was a Maliseet from Victoria County, born in 1914. He enlisted in 1941, with the 1st Canadian Field Company of the Royal Canadian Engineers. He went overseas in September 41, and he served until August of 1945. So for the European theater, which finished in May, June, July, August, almost 3 months later, he dies on August 10th. He had qualified as a motorcyclist, so my first thought is, oh, maybe he was in an accident, because the odds are he wasn't shot by a German in August. Could he have died of his wounds? Maybe. Until you go through a service file. Now, for Canadian veterans, if they died on service, their military file currently is available through Ancestry.com if you want to buy a membership. If a veteran has passed within the past 20 years, their file is still unavailable. But once a veteran has been dead for 20 years, then you can access the military file. Unfortunately, now it's about a 2.5-year backlog. But for private Solas, I did go to Ancestry.com, I downloaded his file. I want to know, how did he die? What killed him in August of 1945? He fell out of a window in the billet. He may have had a bit too much to drink. He may not have had a bit too much to drink. There is about 80, 90 pages of files. I mean, I know the exact reason, but I'm not going to go into all the details. So suffice to say that he died as a result of falling out of the window, hitting his head on the ground, and wasn't found until several hours later. Therefore, he technically died on service as opposed to killed in action. He's buried in the Holton Canadian War Cemetery in Holland. His mother had died before him, so he was survived by his father. And on his grave marker, it states, "In loving memory of my son, he died for liberty, but will live forever with us, remembered with honor." Private Sanford Solas is the uncle to Grade Nicholas. And Grade has finally been able to go to Holland to visit his gravesite. Private Oliver Pulchase served with the Carleton York Regiment, and as you know, that is one of our New Brunswick regiments. He was wounded, came back to Canada, did some training at the Camp Utopia down in Charlotte County. After the war, he became chief of the Woodstock First Nations. And let me see, what else can I tell you? How about this for interesting? 1964. He goes to England with other Canadian chiefs, where he attends the birthday party, the private birthday party of Lord Beaverbrook, his 85th birthday. And there's a movie of that particular birthday party, and Chief Oliver Pulchase is in that movie, celebrating Beaverbrook's 85th birthday. Aircraft woman, First Class Margaret Laboulois, served with the Air Force during the Second World War. She was with the Eel River Bar First Nations. She joined the Air Force in 1939, just after graduating high school. And she served as a photo technician. And most of her work was analyzing photographs for the construction of the Alaska Highway, which, as you know, connects Alaska to Canada into the United States. After the war, she became chief of the Eel River Bar. 1982. Now, in 1982, I'm still taking university courses. She goes to university, Lakehead University. She gets an honors degree in native languages. And let me see here. She was serving at that time as the chief. She was the first female chief in New Brunswick. 1996, she received the Order of Canada for her contributions and leadership to the Indigenous community. 2005, she's awarded the Order of New Brunswick for her protection and promotion of the Mi'kmaq language. And she walked, as her obituary says, on the 19th of April 2013 at the age of 89. The Canadian War Museum had this portrait done of her. She's one of the few Indigenous veterans of the Air Force in the Second World War. It's a beautiful portrait. It is on their website. They had an exhibit in which she was included. The Star Weekly, this particular photograph of her as chief was taken shortly after she was elected in 1970. This particular photograph was taken in 1971. Now I'm going to sort of throw something in there that isn't quite Indigenous. Sergeant Jim Donovan, he's not Indigenous, and Myrtle the Moose, here at Fort Duffin in St. John in 1940. This is why I'm going to show you this picture. The moose is the story here, not so much Jim Donovan. Partridge Island has a foghorn, and as the foghorn goes off, there are lots of documented accounts of moose going to the shore, Bayshore Beach area, and especially cow moose, and the foghorn sounds like a bull moose calling them to do what cow mooses and bull mooses do. But this particular moose, he came to Fort Duffin, and the soldiers there got a bit smart, because she kept coming every day, so they started feeding it. They started to befriend it. As you can see here, this is Jim Donovan. Jim was a friend of mine. And they befriended Myrtle the Moose until December. And on December 25th, Myrtle the Moose became Myrtle the Turkey. So when Jim told me that story and showed me the photograph, of course I got quite excited. It's a Partridge Island story, it's an artillery story, military story, it's his story. A moose, turkey, I love turkey, although I've never had moose meat as a turkey. But one of the soldiers on Partridge Island that he knew was Gunner James Sakobe. He was with the 15th Coast Battery. Now James has an interesting story in that he was actually born in Italy. And as a young child, he was adopted by the Sakobe family at Woodstock and raised as a member of their First Nations. So he served for a short time in the artillery here in St. John. And as you can see here, here's a letter from Partridge Island 1940 that he wrote to a federal cabinet minister. And as you can see, a couple things I want to point out here. As you see by the arrow, the other soldiers of the island were referring to him as a rubber man. I'm going to assume at this point, some of us that are old enough remember in the 50s and 60s a red rubber ball, called an Indian rubber ball. Maybe that's where that reference is for. But also he says, I'm underage. I'm only 15 years old, so here's another underage. We have a statue, a little tiny wooden statue of Abraham Lincoln on the left. And we have two wooden statues of Lieutenant David Kinley, who served on Partridge Island. This is him, well actually the photograph on the right, my fault, so he's actually the same size in both cases. These are little tiny wooden statues. These little wooden statues, as you see here, the reason I showed you Jim Donovan is because James Sakobe carved these little statues. This is Sergeant James Donovan, Jim Donovan, carved. And when he did the moose, he didn't do a cow moose because he said a cow moose looks like a cow. But if I add antlers to it, we'll all know that it's a moose. These are my most prized possessions. Jim and his wife Gladys gave those to me to safekeep. They will stay in my family for as long as my kids want. So those were done. So far I have found 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I found 7 of these wooden statues that James Sakobe carved. Kingscliff First Nation is part of what we're trying to do again. And this is Merle Miller with the Aboriginal Affairs of Brunswick. He went up to Kingscliff, he went to their cemetery, and he photographed all the grave markers that he could tell were veterans, and he made a list of all the veterans there that don't have grave markers, and there are several. Now, Arthur Solomon has been dead for 31 years, so we can get his military file at some point. He served with the North Shore New Brunswick Regiment. Gregory Francis died in 1990. We can get his military service file at some point, and served with the Royal Winnipeg Rifles. Private Peter Barlow, the North Shore New Brunswick Regiment. What a fascinating gentleman. I guess I'll also point out here, just to bring the North Shore New Brunswick Regiment, it's a reserve regiment, served overseas in the Second War. It's a pre-Second War militia unit. It's still in service today up in the northeastern part of the province. And today they still have about 24 Indigenous members from the communities up there that are serving with that particular regiment. So the contributions of our Indigenous veterans is still happening today. Private Peter Barlow, enlisted in 1940, served overseas. He landed at Normandy on D-Day, June 6th, and he stayed overseas until the end of the war in May of 1945. Now, before he enlisted, in 1936, he inherited the chief from his father, John, who was chief of Indian Island. So in 1936, Peter becomes the hereditary chief of Indian Island First Nations, and he remained so until he enlisted in 1939. After the war in 1945, he resumes his responsibilities, and he serves as the hereditary chief for 49 years. But post-war, his contributions to New Brunswick, he was one of the founding members, the founding directors of the Union of New Brunswick Indians. He and his wife Laura were involved with the establishment of the and I'm going to try to pronounce this, the St. Kateri Tekakwitha Catholic Church at Indian Island in 1994. He eventually joined the Richardson branch, number 30 of the Legion. It's important for him to become a Legion member because after the war, Indigenous veterans weren't allowed into the Legions. It wasn't until many decades later before they were even allowed to participate at the National Remembrance Day ceremony in Ottawa. But I'll talk a bit more about that a bit later. Eventually, Peter is given the title of head chief. The chiefs of New Brunswick got together and they selected him as the head chief of all First Nations for all of New Brunswick. He spent the rest of his life being an ambassador for all First Nations in New Brunswick. One of the things that we've done with this project, again, is to put in grave markers, and up at the Miramichi, as you see here, Miramichi Legion number 10 at Eel Ground, we did find that Lance Corporal Elmer Petals served in the Korean War with the Royal Highland Regiment, the Black Watch. He did not have a grave marker. There are several that were found there. So these are the individuals who got together from both the Eel River, from the Legion, and family members to ensure, and last year he was given his grave marker, so his grave is now marked. Unfortunately, when the photograph was sent to me, they gave me everybody's name except for the names of the mother and child, the relatives, the ancestors of Elmer. So I'm still waiting to get their names so I can add them to this caption so they get the recognition also. So we do have some veterans who served in the Korean War. We have veterans like Patrick Joseph Augustin, and I cannot pronounce his traditional name, as you see written there. Micmac, became Chief of Big Cove. Again, another first-time Royal Highland Regiment. He served during the Cold War. He was with Canada's Native Brigade in Germany in the early 1960s. I suppose we could probably, now I don't know, Greg, maybe you might know when the FM was adopted by the Canadian military, maybe from the Rifle Week can date this, but Library and Archives Canada only says in the 1960s. Let me see here. The other thing that I found sad, but not shocking, is as I'm trying to find obituaries of some of these veterans, it's really more miss than hit. That's one of my first go-tos is once we get a grave marker says, he died in 1986. So I searched all of New Brunswick newspapers online for 1986. In most cases, there aren't obituaries for First Nations. Now, in some cases, the name spelling, the military, when they enlisted, misspelled the name. So when you go to the National Archives, we're not going to find the guy's file because the way he spelled his name and the way the military spelled the name are two different. And one of the grave markers that we eventually, like Paddles, that particular one, it took about 6 months of research before someone figured out that maybe the name was misspelled. So they changed the spelling of the word, and the archives found his service file lickety-split. Terry Richardson. Terry's one of our big supporters. He's chief up of the Barlow First Nations up in the northern part of the province. As you see here, he is a Canadian Forces veteran. He joined in 1984, served until 2009. He initially joined, he was an air defense technician. He went overseas in 1991, was his first posting. He went to Qatar for nuclear, biological, and chemical defense. He then remustered when he came back to Canada and became a construction engineering procedures technician. He did a few NATO missions and overseas. In 1998, he went to Bosnia as first part of the 1st Construction Engineering Unit. He went to Afghanistan in 2008 with the other mentoring liaison team. And then he went back to Afghanistan in 2009 on a technical assistant visit. On his return, he retired in 2009. But he used all that military training and that experience to help his community as Barlow First Nations. He started working in capital construction. Then he became the Micmac benefits manager for a Trevally mining company, where he developed a training program specifically to train First Nations candidates in underground mining. He then joined the band council and served on the council until 2020, so almost 2 years ago when he was elected chief. National Indigenous Veterans Day, November 8th. Why do we have a day for Indigenous veterans, and why do we commemorate November 11th? Why 2 different days? Well, you see here in 1994 in Winnipeg, the Indigenous community came together, the veterans, and said, well, we're not allowed to participate at the ceremony in Ottawa. This is 1994. They don't, we're not invited. So let's have our own day. And it is now recognized by Veterans Affairs Canada, the Canadian Forces, as National Indigenous Veterans Day. And if I'm just going to come back here, and of course that is the monument they have in Ottawa. And last November 8th, the branch number 18, the Herman J. Good VC branch of the Legion, joined Barlow, and they had their memorial service. And then on the 11th of November, they came together again to remember all New Brunswickers and all Canadians who served and sacrificed, and their families during wartime. So I want to leave there now and tell you a wee bit more about what this Unmarked Graves project is all about. It is sponsored by the Last Post Fund, and the Last Post Fund, which is headquartered in Montreal, is partially funded by Veterans Affairs Canada. They are a registered charity, so if you, after Barbara's General Store and the Historical Society, if you have any money left, consider the Last Post Fund. And they raise money to make sure that every Canadian veteran who is in an unmarked grave gets a grave marker. Or a Canadian veteran who dies and they don't have enough money for their funeral, or it's a burial, the casket, whatever, they assist. And so, I worked with them. I was able to get a grave marker for a New Brunswick veteran who died and was buried in California without a grave marker. In the past 3 months, I have found 6 New Brunswick veterans who are in unmarked graves, and they will be getting their unmarked, or they will be getting a grave marker. So that's part of what we want to do. Now, if you know anything about Canadian military grave markers, they all have a crest, be it a regimental crest, Army, Navy, Air Force. They may have a maple leaf. Now the Canadian military allows quite a few religious symbols, be it a cross, a Star of David, etc. So for this particular project, a Cree artist, Jason Carter, designed 7 symbols that are significant to our First Nations communities nationally. So these are the grave markers that the families can select, and they all have significance, as you see here. And I'm not going to read them. You can read them. Some of them I knew, some I did not know. And the veteran and the family, of course, still have the option. If they don't want to have one of these symbols, they can place a maple leaf or any other symbol that is authorized through Veterans Affairs Canada, whereas Elmer Paddles did up in Ill ground. The family put a proud Micmac warrior.
Excuse me, Harold.
Yes.
I would like to see all of them. I think they're all awesome, all the symbols.
Yes, I agree. And for those of you who know me, if you take a look at the shirt I'm wearing tonight, I selected orange. It is significant to our First Nations, but it has my symbol, which is my cat. I am a cataholic, so I thought it was important for me that I wear my symbol as I talk about the symbols for our Indigenous veterans. Also, if there is an existing military grave marker, as you see here, the family can have a traditional name in the native language added to the grave marker. It's been a long time coming for our Indigenous veterans to get the respect that they earned and that they deserve. In the national picture, so far, we have researched over 2,500 veterans. We have found that 250, 10%, were in unmarked graves. And this is as of last September. And as of last September, 150 of those 250 grave markers had been ordered to be placed. 15 of those 150, again 10%, will have traditional language added to it. So basically 10% is what we're finding nationally. So when we came to New Brunswick, as of last September, from March to September, we had researched 35. 9 were in unmarked graves. And over the summer, 3 of them were ordered and put in place. There are others that have been ordered. Now again, this is as of last September. It's been 3 months since then. It'll probably be another month or 2 before I update this. But as you can see, right now, there's 9 that we know of that earned, deserved a grave marker on their grave. Luckily, we have quite a bit of support from the province. They've helped us select a First Nation student from St. Thomas. They do have a funding program with St. Thomas to assist Indigenous students. And I'm hoping that particular student eventually can use this research into a thesis topic. All the information eventually will go to the provincial archives. If any of you, and I'm only going to look at Greg, who has an interest. Nicole, I'm not sure what your interest is as a professor, but there's a lot of work here that students can do to get credit for papers. And at the same time, we can add it to our database of Indigenous veterans. So the province has been very good. I work quite closely with the Minister, Arlene Dunn. She has been very supportive. She just says, what do you need? And of course, the first thing I said, I need a big check. But of course, it's getting close to the budget year. So I said, how about a staff person that can help us get the word out and do a bit of research for us? So we got the student and we got one of her staff people. Now, the last post fund, as I said, has been here since 1909, and all eligible veterans. So, for example, when my dad died, he had I'm going to say almost enough money in his bank account to pay for 100% of his funeral. But it wasn't 100%. And what they look at is not what the family has, it's what the veteran has. So they said, your dad is short a few dollars. So we already had the grave marker, so they provided a few dollars to make sure that dad got the dignified funeral that he deserved as having served in 2 wars. If any of you know of any veteran anywhere in Canada, as long as they're Canadian, doesn't matter where they're buried, there is a reciprocal arrangement with the United States for any Canadians buried there. We just want to make sure that they get a grave marker and that their story is recorded and eventually disseminated. I'm not going to read this, and I certainly can't read it in the traditional language of our First Nations, but of course the Royal Canadian Legion, the Act of Remembrance is said every event, and every word in English is as significant to the First Nations community in their own ethnic language. It's important that, I hope you can tell, especially those who know me, I'm pretty passionate about this whole veteran thing. Hopefully I'll have another 5, 10, 15, 20 years to work on this because I want all 400 plus veterans, their stories documented. I want the families first to know. I'm always surprised at the number of families that, well, I think my grandfather was in the war, but I'm not sure which war. And as I said, one case took me to New York for about a month, and then eventually finding out that he was not, in fact, a veteran. And as we've heard, a veteran is a veteran is a veteran. The Legionnaires say it, veterans say it, but I add another line to it now. Our Indigenous veterans will not be equal veterans until we know all of their stories. I'm more than happy to take any questions, and I placed a website that I found just before I logged in. A friend of mine, Hal Scarrop, retired major in the Army, Silver Hawk author. He has a website on First Nation soldiers in the Maritimes. Most of what he has so far is non-maritime Indigenous veterans because there isn't a lot of information yet. So I will be eventually sharing all of this so Hal can add. But I'm more than happy to close off my PowerPoint and then take any questions, any comments. One, if I almost pronounce it properly, in a rough translation, it depends on which language, it can mean many different things, but all basically along the same line of thank you very much for watching and listening. Don't ask too many tough questions. If you do, I'm going to ask Greg to answer them. Thank you.
Yeah, Greg here. Thanks, Harold. So yeah, as Harold said, we have some time and we're online to 8:30 if we need to be. And if anyone has any questions, ask Harold, or any comments, we can just turn on your mic and chat, or there's also the chat feature if you want to type questions. Anyway, we'll just open up the floor and you can just, Harold, you can just field and answer questions as you like.
Hi, Greg. Can I just jump in? Hi, Harold. It's Nicole O'Byrne and my mom.
Hi, Mom.
Yeah, there's Mom. We've been enjoying this a lot. In my research, I've discovered something that was very apparent in your slides, that a lot of Indigenous people who volunteered for the war came back and then took on leadership positions in their communities. And there are lots of them, and I keep running into them, or they're the ones who took the cases forward in court, or they're the ones who really took all of this seriously, even though they lost their status, right? So I just want you to comment on what you've been finding with respect to that, the leadership that they learn, or the skills in the military, and then they come back, and that even though they're displaced and not treated very fairly, they take that experience and then go on and do great things. And I find that so interesting.
I mean, I was a reserve veteran for 8 years, but I've been involved with veterans for 45 plus 50 years. I've known veterans from the Boer War right through to present day. And one thing about the military, whether you are pro-military or not, to me it doesn't matter, but one thing I found about the military is with the training you get, if you do it well, when you get out of the military, you're ready to basically, you can tackle just about any problem. Terry Richardson of Pavanel, I guess, is a great example right now. As soon as you get out of the military, he assumed a role in his community that led to a leadership role. Now, out of the 400 plus, we only have a very small picture of all those veterans. I don't think all 400 became leaders in their community, but I think a large part of them became leaders at some level, whether they're chiefs, served on council, or unfortunately did not end up as Tommy Prince did, basically dying as a pauper. A lot more research has to be done, and I hope you're willing to share what you have, and I can share what I have.
Oh, absolutely, Harold. I wrote a paper on some Métis leaders in Alberta, and what they had in common was military service. And like you said, they took that experience, and when they came home, there was no problem that they felt was insurmountable, right? So I'll send you the paper I wrote, and I've really enjoyed your talk tonight. And I just want to say thank you very much for teaching me a lot about New Brunswick tonight. It's been really fascinating.
Well, thank you, Nicole. I see Kathy. Hi, Kathy. I didn't know you were here. Good to see you.
Harold, Chief Bernard's had her hand up.
Who did?
Chief Bernard.
Hello. Hello, Chief. And congratulations. I had heard you were an honorary colonel, but I haven't had the pleasure of saying hi to you before.
Hi. Thank you for this presentation. It's wonderful, Harold. I'm very excited on hearing all this information, new stuff that I never knew. And of course, it's piqued my interest, and I'm looking to see what I can do on my part in reference to finding some of the unmarked graves. I have an uncle that was served in the military, Harold Bernard from Madawaska First Nation. Now, I'm not sure if that's the one that you noted in your presentation, but I have actually never seen his grave, and I'm going to be, I noted it in my calendar to go visit in the spring. I want to see what his stone looks like, to see if there's any recognition of him as an Indigenous soldier or even a veteran of the forces. And I'm not sure what's on his grave, but I'm going to be looking into that, and I'm interested in doing what I can to help. Thank you.
If I could somehow your email or just contact information, I'd be more than happy to. But there's another project that we haven't gone public with it yet, but because you're here, next year, one of my veterans groups that I'm involved with, we will be planting 70 trees to mark Her Majesty's Platinum Jubilee. We're going to pick 7 communities in the province and plant 10 trees per community. 2 of those communities will be First Nations, and each tree will be dedicated to a veteran. That is a requirement on our part. And the trees will all be planted by children. So the children will do the research, the school children. They'll plant the trees with us. And for every community, we'll have an appropriate cultural ceremony, not only on the First Nations, but on the other communities. So, and also I should mention, I didn't also recognize that Greg Nicholas is actually also an honorary colonel of the 3rd Field Regiment here in St. John. So we have 2 honorary colonels with us tonight, Cheryl and yourself. And Greg, he was in the Air Force Reserve in the 1960s. He wanted to go to Germany to study German, and the military wouldn't let him go over as a reservist, so he left the reserve, basically. It's a fascinating story.
It is. Thank you.
I've got my hand up. Can I introduce myself? Harold, it's Greg. It's interesting. You mentioned Greg Nicholas in the Air Force, and you mentioned the Indigenous woman who was the photo tech. And I think when you talked about her, you mentioned that there weren't a lot of Indigenous people in the Air Force. You didn't. I'm just curious about that. And also, I don't think you mentioned the Navy.
Well, I was referring specifically to the Second World War in terms of Air Force. I haven't come across any that served in the Navy yet. Most New Brunswickers in the Second War, round figures are, I think we had about 44,000, and most of them served in the Army. Then, I mean, I had the figures down, I can't quite remember. I think the Navy came third. The Air Force, I think, had more members serving than the Navy.
It might be a bit academic, but some of the academic literature on World War II, I think the Air Force was also not open to a lot of Black men joining of the three services. So there might be some parallels there. I'm not sure. There might be some other reasons other than just sheer numbers. But anyway, yeah, it's really interesting stuff. And again, I've mentioned a name or two to you. I'll try to contact some of those people whose fathers were, in the armed forces, like back in the 50s and 40s. So it's yeah. And and I've already posted. I've made a link to the last post fund already on our Facebook site.
Thank you, Greg. Your comment about, oh, yes. Go ahead.
Yes, I just posted my email, so if anyone else wishes to contact me, my email, this is the email as the Regional Chief of New Brunswick at the AFN. So it's quite simple to remember, afn.ca.
Good. I'm going to figure out how to save that right now.
I have another question in reference to your presentation. I was wondering if I would be able to get the presentation sent. I saw that you were recording this session, and if it's going to be available again to go through, because I was wondering about the 400 graves. I missed I wasn't able to read the information as you were going through the slides. I was listening to you, and then I forgot to read what was there, but I was hoping that I would be able to get a copy or find a way to have a recording of it. The presentation that Greg Nicholas did the other day with the music with the museum, it was amazing, and they did record it, and you can access that presentation through the museum, the Fredericton Museum. So I was able to get that see that recording again, because my mother missed it, and of course everybody wants to see it again. It's an awesome presentation. So, and I was hoping I'd be able to get yours too, Harold.
Oh, certainly. Actually, one of the things that Merle Miller is supposed to do for us at Aboriginal, I have a second presentation, which is done on behalf of the Legion, and it focuses more on the last post fund and that particular project. That is supposed to be distributed to all of the First Nation communities in New Brunswick. I thought it had already been done, but I can send you the presentation and my notes from tonight to make sure you have it, because I want all of our chiefs and all of the councils to have all the information. Because again, hopefully I've got 20 more years, but I'm really hoping that within the next 5 years we have every unmarked grave marked. That's my goal. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Chief Bernard, we will have a YouTube of this presentation too, and we can send you that link.
That would be perfect. That would be great. Thank you. Sorry, but I have another meeting at 8:15, so I will leave you, and thank you. Bye-bye.
Cheryl, are you still here? I suppose
Yes, I am.
I didn't ask Chief Bernard. She's honorary colonel of which unit?
Royal New Brunswick Regiment.
Oh. A good thing I did not know that, because I probably would have. I probably would have told her something else I have for her.
Okay. And I noticed on the chat, she left you her email address.
Yes, oh yes. I will send her an email tonight. I look forward to seeing her at some point.
Yeah.
And at some point, Cheryl, I have a non-Indigenous project I'm working on. If it advances, I'm going to want to speak to you as a president of RUSI.
Right.
But that might be a few months down the road before I get there. But it's something I've been working on for a little while that has
Okay.
great potential for us.
Well, I enjoyed your presentation tonight. Thank you very much, both to you and Greg.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Thanks for attending.
Any other questions? Or you want to let me off the hook?
Harold,
Hey, Harold. Oh, sorry, Greg.
no, you go ahead. I've been talking a lot. Go ahead.
So just curious, seeing as you're working with the last post, are you helping with us getting grave markers at the Provincial Hospital Cemetery on Sand Cove Road?
No, that graveyard, to my knowledge, has no veterans buried there. However, if
We've got 3 or 4 markers now. We've got last post working with us. I thought you would be, you'd know this one too.
no, I am working only on this particular project for Indigenous veterans.
Okay.
It's real easy to get your finger in too many pies, and sometimes I do that, so I'm being very focused. 400 plus veterans is more than enough to keep me busy for a few years.
Of course, and it's fantastic work. And I'm now very intrigued about the tree planting celebration, and we'll be looking for more information on that in the future.
Yeah, I probably shouldn't have said that one yet, but it's something that hopefully we'll be able to make public shortly.
My lips are sealed.
Pardon me?
My lips are sealed.
Yeah, I know where you live. I'll sick David after you. Anyways, folks, any other comments, questions?
Harold, I had one about the Legion. I had heard, I don't know the details. I'd heard about the Legion in the past, but what was the issue with not allowing Indigenous members? Was it? Did it have anything to do with their veterans status or their pension or something? Like, what was going on?
Well, I was quite surprised when Greg Nicholas mentioned this at his presentation last month. But I think a lot of it just had to do, well, a couple things. One is just the attitude of society at the time.
Okay.
That Indigenous veterans, just the prejudice, the bigotry of the time period, the attitude of the federal government and Indian affairs. For example, non-Indigenous veterans were entitled to, in one particular case, I think the second one now, a figure of $10 a day for some particular purpose, but First Nations were only offered $5 for the same thing, same service, same thing, but they were offered half as much money. Now, again, I haven't done any research to confirm this, but part of what I'm told is the reason that they're only offered half amount of the money is because they lived on reserves, they're already getting money from the federal government, whereas the non-Indigenous veterans were on their own, they had to pay for their house, their land, everything, which was unfair. The Legion, for a number of years, would not allow veterans to become members, but they also wouldn't allow them to even go into a Legion just to have a drink. And then, up until 1994, they weren't welcome at the national ceremony in terms of participants. They could show up as a veteran, but to participate, be recognized, that wasn't allowed. The government there's either the Senate or the House of Commons did have a study done, a report done. Greg Nicholas shared it with us. And in 1998, two recommendations, or the number one recommendation is that the Canadian government recognize Indigenous veterans. And number two, the Royal Canadian Legion recognized Canadian veterans and invite them to participate in our Remembrance Day ceremonies. That's 23, 24 years ago? I was shocked at the date and what the recommendations were. Luckily, we've moved beyond all of that. We have, for our Indigenous veterans, from my point of view, as a non-Indigenous person, there's a lot of catch-up that they have to do, and I want to do my little part to help them. Did that answer your question? Okay, Greg?
I think so. I think too, when you mentioned the bar, I mean, in many provinces, so-called status Indians couldn't, until the 1950s or 60s, depending on the province, they couldn't purchase alcohol or go into. So maybe it had something to do with that too. And the racism, again, that I guess that doesn't surprise us. It's just shocking when you hear that the Legion, which supposedly stood for veterans, didn't stand for all of them. So I'm hoping that they've tried to make some amends for that over the years.
Well, I think so. Now when the Legion goes overseas, they take delegates overseas or delegations overseas to pay respects at Vimy Ridge or Normandy, those type of trips. Our Indigenous veterans are always invited now. Now it took many decades, but I think the Legion only reflected society at the time. There was a lot of prejudice, as we all know, and bigotry, and there still is. But I think, and that's one of the reasons why I saw an opportunity as the New Brunswick representative for New Brunswick Command, as for public relations. That's why I jumped onto this whole thing, so that it can be part of our contribution to moving forward with all of our New Brunswick veterans. I have never seen a Legionnaire in 20 years or another veteran openly display any prejudice against any veteran, be they Black, Indigenous, whatever. I mean, I've seen a lot of "I don't like you," but that's not because you were Black or Indian or Indigenous or Indian. It's because you did something or said something that I didn't like. I've seen lots of that, but I've never seen outright prejudice or bigotry towards anybody. Just upset people because they've had too much to drink or say things. But.
So you're still looking, you're looking for names and tips and things like that. So people can, of course, you're a pretty easy guy to find, but if people do have any tips or any advice for you, you'd be welcome to hear it.
Oh gosh, yes.
Yeah.
Every day, through the Historical Society, there's a role for all of us to play individually and collectively. And hopefully in 2 or 3 or 4, hopefully no more than 5 years, we can say every veteran has been researched, every grave marker that's unmarked is now in place.
Right. Yeah. Well, we can keep going here for a few more minutes. We'll just see if anyone has any more questions or comments for Harold. And again, his presentation and the Q&A will be posted on our YouTube channel. And maybe we'll put a link to Greg Nicholas' talk as well. I didn't realize it was online, so you can put that on our site as well.
Yeah, I think that's good, Greg. I mean, at the time that Graydon was doing his presentation, he wasn't aware that I was doing this. And then when I found out he was doing his, it was a match made in heaven. The two of us coming from two different angles.
Yeah.
We've known each other for many years. We've shared information for many years. So hopefully by people watching this link and his link, both videos, we'll get more people that are willing to help.
Right. Okay, so I feel like the auctioneer here, or for the, just gonna put out one more chance if anyone wants to ask our guest a question tonight. Or make a comment. I was just telling Harold, when we were on earlier, I was just writing up a lecture on World War One this afternoon, and some of this came up in my my PowerPoint slides, and so again, it's good to see some of this research coming out for the public. Okay, well, I think we'll wrap things up for tonight. Again, this will be posted online on our YouTube channel of the New Brunswick Historical Society, and we will put that link on our Facebook site. Next, we have a speaker, another military history speaker for next month, and that link's been posted on the chat. It's also on our Facebook site, and we look forward to seeing people again in the months to come. And everyone take care with the cold weather and the ice and the rain and everything else. And we're all looking forward to getting through the next stage of the public health thing, right? And maybe someday we'll all be able to meet in the same room again and have a live talk, right, Harold? So,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay,
Great.
well, I'm going to stop the recording, and then I'll stay online for a couple of minutes in case Harold has to talk to me or anything, but then I think we're going to close down the